The wind carried the smell of burning wood across the cobbled streets. Curling smoke, rising like fading memories against the evening sky. A hush had fallen over the city, not the peaceful hush of a market closed for the day, but the tense, coiled silence of people holding their breath, unsure of what tomorrow might bring. By now, the grand towers that had once cast their shadows over every alley and courtyard looked more like watchful sentinels than symbols of stability. Even the bells in the cathedral, which for centuries had rung in moments of celebration and warning alike, hung motionless, their ropes swaying lazily in the draught. You could feel it everywhere, the sense that something was ending. Not in a sudden, cataclysmic collapse, but in the slow, steady erosion of certainty. The nobles in their fortified halls still gave orders, still held court with the same pomp as before, but their eyes betrayed them. They had seen the writing on the wall. The people, once obedient and deferential, were beginning to speak in ways they hadn't before. Not loud enough to be called rebellion, but loud enough to make the powerful shift uncomfortably in their velvet-lined chairs. And here's the strange thing about endings. They rarely arrive on schedule. The chroniclers will later point to one decisive event, a single night when the old order fell. But living through it was nothing like that. It was a long unraveling, a thread tugged loose from the tapestry, winding its way silently until the whole cloth began to sag. Rumors were now as common as bread, and they traveled faster than any rider on horseback. In the taverns, over cups of watered ale, people whispered about merchants refusing to pay taxes, about guards abandoning their posts to join roving bands of outlaws, about entire villages swearing loyalty to no lord at all. Out in the countryside, farmers were quietly letting their fields go fallow, waiting to see which way the winds of power would blow before deciding whose banners to raise. But the most unsettling change wasn't in the streets or the market sit, was in the very rituals that had once bound the society together. Weddings, which had always been grand public affairs meant to display alliances, were now kept small and private. Feast days passed without the usual lavish processions. Even the punishments, once carried out in the public square as a grim reminder of authority, were now handled in the shadows. The machinery of order was still turning, but more slowly, more quietly, as if afraid to call too much attention to itself. On one of those uneasy evenings, I found myself walking through the lower quarter, where the narrow streets twisted like a knot of rope. The lamps had been lit, but many of them flickered, starved of oil. The shutters on most houses were closed tight, though here and there a pair of eyes would peek out from behind them. At the edge of the quarter, where the old stone wall was beginning to crumble, I came across a group of men huddled around a fire. They weren't soldiers, but they carried weapons. Not the polished swords of the nobility, but farm tools, scythes, hammers, and pitchforks, worn smooth from years of honest labor. They didn't speak to me at first, just watched, measuring my steps. Finally, one of them asked where I was headed. I told them I was merely passing through, and they nodded, but in that nod, I saw something I hadn't expected: mutual recognition. They weren't defending their homes from a foreign invader. They were guarding against the slow, creeping decay of a world that no longer worked for them. Further along, I reached the old market square. It should have been bustling at this hour, filled with the smell of roasted meat, the cries of hawkers, selling wares from far-off lands. Instead, only a few stalls were open, their goods meager, and their owners watchful. I spoke with an elderly merchant, his hands trembling slightly as he counted out coins for a customer. He told me that trade had been thinning for years, but lately it felt as if the very roads themselves were closing. "It's not just that fewer travelers come through," he said quietly. "It's that those who do, don't bring good news." And yet, amid all the fear and uncertainty, there was a curious undercurrent of something else: possibility. The same cracks that let the cold in also let in the first light of dawn. Some of the younger folk were speaking openly of building something new, of casting off the chains of the past and shaping a future in which power wasn't decided by birthright or coin. To the elders, it sounded like dangerous dreaming. To the youth, it was the only way forward. As the night deepened, I returned to the higher streets, where the glow from the great hall's windows spilled across the flagstones. Inside, the lords and their advisors sat in council, arguing over what measures could be taken to preserve the old ways. More guards, more taxes, more decrees. But even as they spoke, their voices rising in frustration, you could sense that they no longer believed in their own solutions. They were patching holes in a ship that had already taken on too much water. By midnight, the city was quiet again, save for the occasional bark of a stray dog. I stood at the edge of the wall, looking out over the fields and forests beyond. Somewhere, out there, in the darkness, the first seeds of a different order were already sprouting. Perhaps it would be kinder, perhaps harsher, there was no telling. But one thing was certain. The world I had known, the one that had shaped every law, every tradition, every punishment and reward, was slipping away. And maybe, I thought, that's the way it had to be. The past is a fine place to learn from, but a dangerous place to live in. As the smoke from distant fires curled higher into the sky, I wondered if, years from now, someone else would stand in this very spot and tell the story of how it all ended, not with a roar, but with a long, fading sigh. By the late medieval period, justice was no longer just a matter of maintaining peace. It had become a powerful tool in the hands of those who ruled. For kings, queens, and ambitious nobles, punishment was no longer simply about deterring crime. It was a weapon to cement authority, enrich the treasury, and eliminate rivals without lifting a sword. And the deeper we look, the more we see how the scales of justice tilted under the weight of greed. In many European kingdoms, fines replaced traditional punishments, but these were not fines in the modern sense. They were staggering sums, enough to strip a peasant of his livelihood or bankrupt a merchant. If you stole a loaf of bread and had no money to pay, you could lose your home. But if you did have money, suddenly your crime might be forgiven. Justice was elastic, stretching or snapping depending on the size of your purse. It became a dangerous game where the wealthy could buy their way out of the noose, while the poor dangled helplessly from it. This system of monetary mercy was more than corruption, it was a calculated revenue stream. Some kings openly encouraged their sheriffs to impose harsher penalties, knowing that fear of them would drive offenders to pay bribes instead. The king got richer, the sheriffs got fatter purses, and the common folk got the message. In medieval Europe, the law didn't just watch you, it owned you. Of course, it wasn't only the monarchs who saw opportunity in this. Local lords ran their estates like miniature kingdoms, holding their own courts and doling out justice in ways that were less about fairness and more about control. Imagine a farmer accused of letting his pigs stray into the lord's fields. The trial would be held in the manor hall, presided over by the same lord whose land had supposedly been damaged. Witnesses, likely the lord's own men. Evidence, whatever the lord said it was. And the punishment, a hefty fine paid directly into his coffers, or, for those unable to pay, confiscation of goods, livestock, or even land. For those in power, this was a self-feeding cycle. The more fines they collected, the more wealth they accumulated. And with more wealth came more soldiers, more influence, and more ability to bend the law to their will. Even religious institutions joined in. Monasteries, while offering sanctuary to the accused, sometimes charged protection fees to those hiding within their walls. Priests could absolve sins, but for a donation, of course. Justice, morality, and even salvation had price tags. One infamous example comes from 14th century England. Records show that in certain towns, royal justices were sent not to dispense fair trials, but to collect amercements, fines often so inflated that they resembled ransoms. A merchant might be fined for selling goods of improper weight, or disturbing the market order. Vague charges that could be invented on the spot. If he paid, the case disappeared. If not, his stall was seized, his goods sold, and his name ruined. What made this especially dangerous was how it warped the public's perception of justice. Punishment no longer carried moral authority. It was seen as a transaction. A knight, caught in a tavern brawl, could settle the matter with a generous gift to the court, while a peasant in the same fight might find himself whipped, branded, or worse. The people began to understand that the gallows did not await the guilty, only the unlucky and the poor. But greed did not just corrupt the process. It escalated the severity of punishments for those who could not pay. If you failed to meet your fine, your debt might be paid in flesh. Debtors' prisons became holding pens for those who had nothing left to give, where overcrowding, starvation, and disease acted as slow executions. Some were forced into public humiliation, wearing heavy iron collars, chained in the town square, until family members could scrape together the ransom. Ironically, this system of greed-fueled justice often backfired. Pushed too far, communities began to resent the crown or the local lord. In times of famine or hardship, the people's patience wore thin, and tax collectors or sheriffs became targets of violence. Revolts, like the English peasants' revolt of 1381, often had their roots in this exploitation the moment when people realized they were less subjects and more prey. The corruption also fed paranoia among rulers. If a noble grew too wealthy, it was easy enough for the king to accuse him of treason or offenses against the crown, seizing his lands under the guise of justice. In France, during the reign of Philip IV, wealthy members of the Knights Templar were accused of heresy, tortured into confessions, and executed, their vast riches absorbed by the monarchy. While the official story claimed divine justice, the real motive was gold. In this world, crime was not a fixed concept. A man could be law-abiding one day and an outlaw the next if his fortune attracted the wrong kind of attention. And if the courts were tools of the powerful, then innocence was not a defense, only influence was. The deeper truth is that greed did not simply taint medieval justice. It reshaped it entirely. Punishments were not measured by the crime, but by the wealth of the accused. Justice became a stage. The punishments a performance designed to remind the powerless of their place, and the powerful of their untouchable status. And yet, despite its brutality and unfairness, this system survived for centuries. Why? Because it worked for those in control. It kept wealth flowing upward, maintained social hierarchies, and ensured that the machinery of power remained well-oiled with gold. For the common people, it was a cruel reminder that in medieval Europe, the scales of justice were not balanced. They were chained to the coffers of the ruling class. But as history would soon show, greed has a way of pushing societies to their breaking point. And when the system finally cracked, it would not just be the poor who paid the price, it would be the kings and lords who had built their thrones on a foundation of stolen coin. If the medieval mind could conjure a device purely to horrify, the pear of anguish might be the most infamous. At first glance, it resembled a harmless piece of fruit carved in metal, a bulb-shaped tool with delicate petal-like segments that opened and closed with a screw mechanism. But unlike the pears on the banquet table, this one was not meant for eating. It was meant for breaking in the candlelit chambers of a medieval dungeon. The accused might be bound in the center of a stone room, the air damp and the walls sweating with condensation. A jailer would stand over them holding a small leather pouch. From it, he would withdraw the pear, polished, heavy, and glinting in the flicker of torchlight. The sight alone could make prisoners shiver, because everyone who had heard rumors about this device knew it was not a bluff. The pear came in variations, each designed for different crimes. In cases of blasphemy, it might be inserted into the mouth. For liars, the same fate awaited. In accusations involving women, such as moral crimes or witchcraft, it might be placed elsewhere. The cruelty was in the design. Once inserted, the screw at the base would be turned slowly, forcing the metal petals to open outward. The expansion would cause tearing, bruising, and agony, and in the case of the mouth, it could dislocate jaws or break teeth entirely. The official justification was almost always confession. A priest or magistrate might stand nearby, demanding the accused admit their guilt. But in reality, this was less about obtaining truth and more about asserting dominance, about breaking the human will in front of an audience. Records from the 17th century, though some historians debate the precise dating, describe the pear of anguish being used not only in interrogations, but also in public humiliation. Imagine a market square, bustling with merchants and customers. Suddenly, the crowd parts as soldiers drag a prisoner into the center. The pear is forced into their mouth, the mechanism turned just enough to prevent speech, but not enough to kill. The victim is then left to stand before the crowd, drooling, choking, unable to close their mouth. It was a theatrical statement. Here is what happens to those who speak falsely or defy the church. Whether every account is literal truth, or part of the exaggerated lore of torture, one thing is certain: the idea of the pair of anguish was enough to terrify. In medieval Europe, fear itself was often as effective as the punishment. Word of mouth traveled fast, and stories of people silenced by this metal fruit would spread through villages like wildfire. Parents might even whisper it to children: "Mind your tongue, or they'll give you the pear." The device's simplicity was part of its menace. It required no large contraption, no elaborate setup. A single executioner could carry it in his belt pouch. It could be used indoors, in a dark cell, or in broad daylight before a crowd, and it left marks: torn flesh, broken bones that ensured the victim would carry the memory forever. One chilling account tells of a merchant in the Low Countries, accused of swindling customers. According to the record, he refused to confess. The magistrate ordered the pear to be applied in his mouth. The petals expanded until, with an audible crack, his jawbone broke. Still, he did not confess. At last, the magistrate ordered the device removed, but the man could never speak again, without pain. He was released, perhaps as a warning, and became a walking advertisement for the power of the city's justice. The cruelty of the pear lay not only in physical pain, but in its assault on dignity. To be gagged, unable to defend oneself, verbally, to be reduced to moans and muffled cries, while others watched, this was psychological warfare. In a time when honor and public reputation meant survival, such humiliation could destroy a person even more thoroughly than death. Today, some historians debate whether all the versions we hear about were genuinely used, or whether certain accounts were exaggerated in later centuries to paint the medieval period as even darker than it was. After all, the Victorians had a taste for dramatizing history, especially its violent parts. Still, museum collections in Europe display metal pears dating back several hundred years. Their mechanisms, still functional. Holding one in your hand, today you can feel its cold weight. The petals fold neatly inward until the device is almost elegant, and then, with a turn of the screw, they bloom outward in a way that makes your stomach twist. It's easy to imagine the dread such an object would inspire in an age when torture was a legitimate arm of law enforcement. The pear of anguish serves as a grim reminder of how justice and cruelty were often intertwined in medieval Europe. It wasn't enough to punish someone. They had to be made an example. The more memorable the punishment, the better it worked as a deterrent. The pear fit this purpose perfectly. Portable, terrifying, and capable of leaving scars both visible and invisible. It also reminds us that silence was sometimes more dangerous than speech. For the victim, every second the petals opened meant another level of injury. Yet for the crowd, that silence was the point. Proof that the system could literally and figuratively close your mouth. Centuries later, the pear has entered the realm of dark folklore. It appears in novels, in films, and in the whispered histories, told on nighttime ghost tours. Whether every tale is strictly accurate or not, the legacy of fear it represents is very real. It is a symbol of a time when to speak against the wrong person could mean not just death, but a slow, deliberate destruction of one's body and spirit. And perhaps the cruelest truth is this: in the medieval mind, devices like the pear of anguish were not viewed as evil. They were seen as instruments of order, tools to maintain the stability of society. Pain was not the side effect. It was the method. In our modern age, where the rule of law at least strives to avoid physical cruelty, it is almost unthinkable to imagine such an object being considered legitimate. But step back into the shadowed streets of a medieval city. Hear the clang of armor and the murmurs of fearful townsfolk. And the pear fits right in, not on the banquet table, not in a fruit basket, but in the hands of someone who believed fear was the strongest law of all. In the late medieval period, as justice systems became more organized, yet still deeply influenced by spectacle and fear, some punishments were designed to humiliate offenders in ways that would scar them for life socially, if not physically. One particularly cruel and widely used device was the cucking stool, and its aquatic cousin, the ducking stool. While these punishments often targeted women accused of gossiping, scolding, or minor disturbances, men could also fall victim if they were seen as disruptive to the moral order. The method was straightforward in design, but devastating in social consequence. The condemned person would be strapped to a sturdy wooden chair fixed to a long beam, then either displayed in a public square or lowered repeatedly into a river or pond. The humiliation began before the water even touched them. Villagers would gather in droves, shouting insults, throwing rotten vegetables, or hurling buckets of foul-smelling refuse. The journey to the water was as much a part of the punishment as the immersion itself. Every step amplified the shame. Once at the chosen site, the offender would be dunked into icy, murky water, held under for a few moments, and then brought back up, gasping, only to be plunged down again. While the intention was often more symbolic than lethal, there were many documented cases where the victim drowned or suffered severe hypothermia. Authorities saw this punishment as a corrective measure, especially for those whose supposed crimes were considered nuisances rather than direct threats to life or property. Yet in a society obsessed with reputation, the damage to one's standing could be irreparable. Being seen in the cucking stool marked someone as morally suspect for years, even if their offense was something as trivial as arguing too loudly with a neighbor. It's important to note that in medieval towns and villages, community cohesion relied heavily on conformity and submission to social norms. Anyone who drew too much attention or challenged authority, be it a magistrate, a church leader, or even a well-connected merchant, risked public chastisement. The cucking stool, thus, became a powerful tool for enforcing silence, especially among women whose voices were considered disruptive to the patriarchal order. Some historians argue that its popularity was less about justice and more about control, a way to keep certain groups visibly in check. Not all uses of the stool involved water. In some cases, offenders were simply strapped in and left in the market square for hours, forced to endure mockery and derision. Children would often be encouraged to join in, throwing pebbles or gearing loudly, embedding the lesson in the next generation's minds. Step out of line, and this could be you. The wooden frame itself was often decorated with crude paintings or inscriptions mocking the condemned, making it an almost theatrical prop in the town's ongoing moral drama. There were even variations of this punishment that blurred the line between medieval and early modern practices. In some places, offenders were wheeled around the town in the stool, effectively turning them into a moving spectacle. This mobile humiliation ensured that no corner of the community could claim ignorance of the person's shame. The result was not just punishment, but the careful cultivation of fear, a reminder that everyone was always being watched. The psychological toll was immense. Medieval society placed enormous value on honor and public image. Losing either could destroy livelihoods, marriages, and family reputations. Even if someone survived the physical ordeal without lasting injury, the memory of being paraded or submerged before the entire community could haunt them for the rest of their life. In that sense, the cucking stool was a form of slow social execution, killing not the body, but the respectability that allowed a person to thrive. Some modern readers might be tempted to dismiss such punishments as crude relics of a less enlightened age, but echoes of the same principle still exist in the digital era. Public shaming has simply moved from the marketplace to the internet, where reputations can be drowned just as quickly, sometimes in minutes rather than hours. The medieval dunking might have been cold and wet, but at least it had an endpoint. Online humiliation can linger indefinitely, accessible to anyone with a search engine. Still, in the context of the time, these punishments were deeply woven into the legal fabric. The local constable, often accompanied by town elders or a clergy member, would oversee the entire process to ensure it followed custom. Records of such events were sometimes even kept in parish logs, as if noting them down in neat handwriting could disguise the cruelty beneath. The cucking stool's eventual decline was due less to humanitarian progress and more to shifting legal priorities. As more formal court systems emerged and monetary fines became a preferred method of punishment, the time-consuming spectacle of public dunking lost some of its appeal to authorities. Yet, even as the devices fell out of regular use, they lingered in the cultural memory as symbols of moral correction. It's fascinating to imagine the conflicting emotions such events must have stirred. On one hand, the gathered crowd might have felt a grim satisfaction in seeing justice done or at least a version of justice they recognized. On the other hand, for anyone with a hint of empathy, watching a neighbor shiver and sputter under the weight of communal scorn might have sparked a quiet unease. But in a society where survival often depended on staying in the majority's good graces, few dared speak against the practice. Silence, after all, was safer by the late 18th century. The cucking stool was more a curiosity than a common tool of justice, but its memory lingered as a warning. The law was not just about right and wrong. It was about power, visibility, and the ability to control narratives. In medieval times, as now, the stage of punishment was as important as the punishment itself. And for those strapped to the chair, whether in water or under the open sky, the real sentence was not measured in minutes of dunking but in years of whispered reminders. By now, you've seen punishments that chilled the spine and made the stomach churn. But this was something different. It wasn't about fire, blood, or the swing of an executioner's axe. No, this was a punishment that broke you slowly, quietly, until you forgot who you were. It was called the mask of shame, and though it looked harmless compared to a gallows or a torture rack, it had the power to destroy a person's dignity completely. Imagine a crude metal mask, cold to the touch, shaped into exaggerated animal faces, donkey snouts, pig noses, or wide mocking grins. Some even had bells attached, so that everywhere you went, people could hear you coming. You didn't just wear it, you lived in it until the town decided you had learned your lesson. The crimes, they weren't always violent. In fact, many who wore the mask had simply spoken too much. Gossipers, liars, or those who dared insult someone of higher status could find themselves locked into this humiliating device. The mask was often fitted with a spiked plate inside, pressing against the tongue so you couldn't speak without pain. That way your mouth, once the weapon, was now silenced. But the real cruelty wasn't physical. It was the way the mask made you look. People laughed, children pointed, and strangers crossed the street just to hurl insults. It turned the entire community into your jailers. No stone walls, no guards, just an endless parade of sneers and whispers that chipped away at your soul. One account from the German town of Nuremberg tells of a woman named Grete, a baker's wife accused of spreading lies about a wealthy merchant. She swore she was telling the truth, but truth didn't matter. The merchant had influence, and the punishment was decided. They strapped a heavy iron mask to her head, the mouthpiece pressing cruelly against her lips, and sent her walking through the market. Every step was torture, not because of the weight, but because of the eyes. The same neighbors who once bought her bread now treated her like a pest. She couldn't eat, couldn't drink, and at night, she lay awake with the metal biting into her skin. By the time the mask was removed, Grete was a different woman. She spoke little, smiled less, and never again dared to voice her opinion. You see, medieval justice didn't just aim to punish crimes. It aimed to change perhaps more honestly, to break you into something that fit neatly into the world's hierarchy. If you were loud, you became silent. If you were proud, you became humble. And if you were defiant, you became obedient. The mask of shame was a silent teacher, but its lessons lasted a lifetime, even today. You might think such things are gone, but perhaps they've only changed shape. We no longer strap people into iron masks, but the world still finds ways to humiliate and silence those who speak out of turn. Social ridicule, online shaming, public scandal, they work on the same principle. Make someone feel so exposed, so mocked, that they retreat into themselves and never raise their voice again. Back then, the sound of the mask's bells announced your disgrace. Now, it might be the ping of a phone with another cruel message, or the click of a camera catching your worst moment. The method changes, but the effect, the crushing of the human spirit, remains hauntingly familiar. In the end, perhaps the most terrifying punishments aren't the ones that spill blood, but the ones that make you wish you didn't exist at all. The mask of shame didn't kill its victims. It simply made them fade away. In the waning light of a medieval afternoon, the air hung heavy with anticipation. Villagers crowded the edge of the village pond, their chatter rising and falling like the breeze. In the center of all this stood the ducking stool, a crude wooden chair bolted to the end of a long beam, balanced precariously over the murky water. It was not a device of swift execution, but of public humiliation, a punishment designed to soak not just the body, but the pride. You can imagine the creak of the wood as the stool was pulled into position, the ropes straining under the weight. The condemned, most often accused, scolds, gossips, or those suspected of witchcraft, would be strapped in tight. There was no escape once seated. The villagers would stand shoulder to shoulder, ready to jeer, laugh, or even cheer as the beam swung down. A splash would follow, sending ripples across the pond, and the victim's muffled gasps would be swallowed by the cold water. Unlike the gallows or the executioner's axe, the ducking stool was not necessarily lethal, at least not officially. But the danger was real. Many victims were repeatedly plunged beneath the surface until they sputtered and coughed, their lungs burning. If the crime was serious enough in the eyes of the crowd, they might hold the person down longer each time. The punishment danced dangerously between humiliation and drowning. What's striking is how often the ducking stool was used for what we'd now consider petty offense: stalking back to a husband, spreading rumors, or being a troublesome woman. It was a punishment deeply rooted in the gender politics of the era, a way of literally submerging a woman's voice until it was silenced by water and shame. The crowd didn't just witness justice, they actively participated in it, hurling insults, throwing rotten vegetables, and relishing the spectacle. And yet, the device had its defenders. Some claimed it was a mild alternative to harsher punishments like flogging or branding. But mild or not, it carried a deep cruelty. The psychological trauma, the public spectacle, and the cold shock of the pond could leave scars far deeper than the water's reach. In some towns, the ducking stool evolved into the cucking stool, where the offender was paraded through the streets before their watery ordeal. This procession served as a moving warning to others: stay in line, or you'll be next. The irony is that the humiliation often worked in the opposite way, strengthening the resolve of those who suffered it, turning them into quiet rebels who carried their resentment like a hidden dagger. The ducking stool's legacy lasted longer than you might think. Records show its use even into the 18th century, long after other medieval punishments had faded into history. And while the device itself is gone, the idea of public shaming lives on in stocks, pillories, and even in our modern online trials, where reputations are submerged in the murky waters of public opinion. As we leave the pond behind, you can still hear the echo of the crowd's laughter and the cold splash that silenced another voice. But the next punishment on our journey takes us far from the water into the choking smoke of the executioner's pyre, where fear and superstition fed flames that could consume more than just flesh. By the time we step into this punishment, you've already seen enough medieval cruelty to make you squirm. But this one manages to be humiliating, exhausting, and oddly comical all at the same time. Imagine you've had a few too many ales at the local tavern. You stumble out into the cobblestone streets, singing too loudly, maybe knocking over a vendor's apple cart without even realizing it. In most modern places, you'd get a fine or a stern warning. But in medieval Europe, the town guards would grab you, and the next thing you know, you'd be wearing a barrel. Yes, a literal barrel. The drunkard's cloak was exactly what it sounds like: an empty wooden cask with holes cut out for your arms and head. The offender was forced to step inside, the barrel strapped around them, turning them into a slow-moving, clumsy spectacle. And you didn't just get to sit quietly in a corner. Oh no. You had to parade through the streets like that, your shame on full display for everyone to laugh at. The barrel was heavy, awkward, and smelled faintly of whatever had been stored in it before, usually ale or wine. That meant, as you trudged along, sweating and stumbling, the scent clung to you like a cruel joke, as if to remind everyone exactly why you were in there. The punishment wasn't just about discomfort, it was about making you a living warning to others: don't be this fool. Children would run alongside, pointing and giggling. Market vendors would shout out sarcastic offers: care for another drink, good sir, and heaven help you if you fell. The barrel made getting up almost impossible, leaving you flailing like a tipped-over turtle while the crowd roared with laughter. But there was a darker side to this spectacle. The drunkard's cloak wasn't always just for harmless tavern rowdies. In some towns, anyone deemed publicly disorderly could be shoved into one. including beggars, dissenters, or even those who dared to insult local officials. The humiliation was the point, and humiliation was a powerful tool for keeping people in line. The psychological impact was devastating. Once word spread that you'd worn the barrel, you carried that shame for months, maybe years. It was social branding without leaving a physical mark. And in small towns where everyone knew everyone else, that kind of reputation could be more damaging than a fine or even a short prison stay. But why a barrel? Some historians believe it came from the idea of putting someone in what they love. Most in this case, alcohol. Others think it was simply practical. Barrels were everywhere in the medieval period, easy to repurpose for a quick punishment. Whatever the reason, it was an unforgettable form of justice. And here's the thing. People loved watching it. Public shaming drew bigger crowds than most sermons. It was entertainment wrapped in morality, a chance for the community to laugh at someone else's downfall, while telling themselves they'd never be so foolish. What's fascinating is that this wasn't just a one-town quirk. The drunkard's cloak was used in England, Scotland, and even parts of Germany and the Netherlands. Records from Newcastle in the 17th century describe it vividly, with detailed accounts of offenders forced to march from tavern to tavern while the crowd jeered. Of course, the punishment had its risks. The weight of the barrel could cause bruising, abrasions, or even injury if worn for long periods. On hot days, the confined space could lead to heat exhaustion, and if someone was already heavily intoxicated when they were strapped in, the risk of collapse was real. But to the authorities, those were acceptable dangers. After all, the point wasn't kindness. Even centuries later, the idea of the drunkard's cloak has survived in pop culture and reenactments, often shown as a humorous curiosity. But in its original time, it wasn't funny for the person wearing it. It was slow, sweaty, exhausting, and humiliating. And the fact that it worked so well as a deterrent says a lot about how medieval communities valued public order, and the public humiliation it sometimes required to maintain it. But if you think that's as far as public shaming went in medieval justice, you're about to be proven wrong, because our next punishment cranks the embarrassment up several notches, with an added twist. It wasn't just about the offender, it was about punishing their whole identity, and for that, we need to talk about what happened when medieval justice got personal. In the buzzing heart of a medieval marketplace, where merchants hawked their goods and gossip spread faster than the scent of roasted meat, an unusual spectacle was about to unfold. The crowd, a thick weave of peasants, traders, and the occasional curious noble, gathered not to buy grain or fabric but to watch a man prove his innocence by carrying a lump of burning iron in his bare hands. Yes, you heard that right, bare hands. No gloves, no cloth, no trickery. Just skin, heat, and faith. This was the infamous trial by hot iron, one of the most nerve-wracking ordeals of the Middle Ages. The idea was simple in its cruelty. If you could carry the red-hot iron across a set distance without dropping it, and your wounds healed cleanly, over the next few days, you were innocent in the eyes of God. If your hands blistered, festered, and stank of infection, well, let's just say the hangman would be polishing his rope. The belief behind this punishment was rooted in divine intervention. Medieval law often saw no need for forensic evidence or witness accounts. Why bother with messy details when God could simply reveal the truth through pain? The trial wasn't just about strength. It was about piety. The thinking went, surely if your heart was pure, God would shield you from harm, and if he didn't, well, clearly you had something to hide. Our particular scene involves a man named Aldrich, a blacksmith accused of stealing a noble's prized hunting hawk. Now, Aldrich's hands were as calloused as cobblestone from years at the forge, but even he knew this was no advantage. Steel might be his trade, but red-hot iron without tongs was a death sentence for his palms. The local priest, solemn and certain, blessed the iron in a brief ceremony that somehow made it even more terrifying. Blessings in the Middle Ages had a strange way of turning impending doom into God's will. The crowd parted as two guards brought forth the iron thick, cylindrical, glowing a furious orange. You could feel its heat from several paces away, the air shimmering above it. Aldrich's eyes darted to the exit of the square. Running was an option, but so was getting shot in the back with a crossbow. He opted to stay. The priest's voice rose above the murmurs. "If you are innocent, the Lord shall keep you safe." "Step forward." Aldrich stepped. His lips moved in silent prayer, perhaps in quiet negotiation with God. The guards laid the iron on a small platform before him. A hush fell. He reached out, and for the briefest moment, hesitation danced in. His eyes, then he grasped it. The sound was instant, a wet sizzle, like meat on a pan. The crowd gasped. A child whimpered. Aldrich's jaw clenched, his muscles rigid, as he took 3 deliberate steps, each one echoing in the sudden silence. He reached the end of the path, dropped the iron onto another platform, and staggered back, clutching his smoking palms. By medieval rules, this wasn't over. His hands would be bound and checked after 3 days. If the burns were healing clean and free of pus, God had cleared him. If not, well, the gallows awaited. The cruel beauty of this ordeal was that survival didn't depend solely on your faith, depended on infection control, something medieval Europe was famously bad at. Dirt, unwashed bandages, and the general lack of hygiene meant most people failed the second part of the test. Aldrich, however, had an advantage. His wife Elaine was a healer. She cleaned his wounds with boiled water, packed them with honey, rare but known antiseptic, and wrapped them in clean linen. 3 days later, the verdict shocked the village. Aldrich's hands were healing well. The priest declared him innocent, the noble fumed in quiet disbelief, and the crowd buzzed with gossip for weeks. Whether it was God's will, Elaine's skill, or pure stubborn luck, Aldrich walked away free, though he never worked another day. In the forge without gloves, this punishment wasn't limited to theft. Trials by hot iron could be used for accusations ranging from blasphemy to adultery, and the weight of the iron could vary. Some unlucky souls had to carry it for several paces, while others merely held it as the priest recited a long prayer, every extra word making the metal's heat sink deeper into flesh. Of course, this ordeal faded from use over the centuries, replaced by more civilized forms of justice, though one could argue the rack and the stocks weren't much better. Still, for those who endured it, the trial by hot iron was a moment when faith, fear, and physical agony collided in front of the entire community, and somewhere in a quiet medieval village, people still whispered about the blacksmith who carried the burning iron and lived to tell the tale. In the chronicles of medieval justice, sometimes the strangest punishments came not from the minds of cruel kings or sadistic judges, but from the villagers themselves, who, when provoked, could create spectacles of absurdity that rivaled anything in the official law books. Take, for instance, the peculiar tale of the Goose Tribunal in the village of Langenberg, somewhere deep in the forests of 15th century Europe. It began with an accusation that would make any modern court stenographer do a double-take. A goose was charged with assault. Yes, you heard that correctly. The story goes that a particularly aggressive farm goose had developed a habit of biting townsfolk, especially those who dared to pass too close to its owner's yard. The final straw came when the goose lunged at the local baker's apprentice, ripping a chunk of his apron and nearly breaking the skin. Enraged, the townspeople demanded justice not from the owner, but from the goose itself. Now, here's where medieval logic shines in all its baffling glory. Animals could, and often did, stand trial in Europe during this period. Pigs, dogs, horses, and yes, even insects, were sometimes given full legal proceedings. The reasoning was simple. If a creature caused harm, it had disturbed the moral order of the community, and thus must answer for its crime. In the case of our ill-tempered goose, the villagers set up a miniature trial in the market square. Picture the scene: a long wooden table with 3 village elders seated like solemn judges, a scribe with quill in hand ready to record the proceedings, and in the center, a bewildered goose tethered to a post, hissing and flapping its wings. Witnesses were called people who had suffered pecks and nips, each recounting their tales of unexpected poultry aggression. Some exaggerated for effect, claiming the goose had murder in its eyes. The baker's apprentice, still nursing his pride, swore that the bird was possessed by some demonic spirit. Of course, the goose had no defense lawyer, but the owner was allowed to speak on its behalf. He argued that the goose was merely protecting its territory and that the fault lay with the townsfolk for provoking it. The judges conferred, scratching their beards and weighing this feathered menace's fate. Finally, the verdict was delivered. The goose was guilty of repeated unprovoked attacks, and sentenced to public humiliation followed by banishment from the village. But humiliation in medieval terms didn't just mean a stern talking to it, meant full-on theatrics. They dressed the goose in a tiny cloth tunic, tied a little wooden placard around its neck that read "Biter of Innocence," and paraded it through the streets while children jeered and threw grain at it. The crowd roared with laughter. Though some swore, the goose hissed louder than ever, as if plotting revenge. After the procession, the poor creature was escorted beyond the village boundary and released into the wild. Rumor had it the goose survived, and years later, travelers spoke of a particularly large and vicious bird haunting the nearby marshes, pecking at unsuspecting fishermen. Whether it was the same goose, or just a story to scare children, no one could say for sure. Now it's easy to laugh at such absurdity, but the Goose Tribunal actually reveals a lot about medieval culture. For one, it shows how deeply they believed in the idea that every living thing, animals, was bound by moral law. It also illustrates their love for public spectacle. Justice wasn't just about fairness. It was about putting on a show that reinforced community values, gave people a good story to tell, and maybe even taught a lesson, albeit to a creature incapable of understanding it. But this tale of the goose also leads us to a far more disturbing chapter of animal trials, one where the consequences were anything but humorous. For in another part of Europe, a similar trial would lead not to banishment or humiliation, but to outright execution, and not just for one animal, but for an entire family of them. And when I tell you what kind of animal it was, you'll understand why the villagers saw no room for mercy, because our next punishment wasn't handed down to a goose or a pig, but to a creature that medieval people believed was a true agent of the devil himself. In the dimly lit chambers of medieval justice, some punishments weren't about ending your life immediately. They were about ending your dignity first, inch by inch. Among the many cruel devices of the era, one stood out for its unsettling mixture of psychological and physical torture: the infamous chair of torment. This was no ordinary chair. It was the kind of seat you'd never want to be offered, no matter how polite the host seemed. At first glance, it looked like a sturdy wooden chair, the kind you might imagine in an old tavern or a dusty courtroom. But upon closer inspection, your stomach would turn. The seat, backrest, armrests, and even the footrest were covered with hundreds of iron spikes, each sharpened to an unforgiving point. These weren't just decorative. They were designed to pierce skin, dig into muscle, and create a pain so sharp that it became a form of constant screaming in the mind. The victim would be forced to sit down, often stripped to make sure no clothing offered protection. Sometimes, the accused was bound with tight leather straps to ensure they couldn't even twitch without pressing further into the spikes. And here's the cruel twist. The spikes were deliberately not sharp enough to cause instant death. They were sharp enough to puncture flesh, to draw blood, and to ensure every movement felt like a fresh wound, but dull enough to prolong the agony. In many recorded cases, the victim wasn't just left there. A fire would be lit beneath the chair, heating the iron spikes until they were scorching hot. Imagine already having hundreds of wounds in your skin, and now those wounds are pressed against burning metal. The pain would bypass the brain's ability to reason. It wasn't punishment anymore. It was an obliteration of the human will. This punishment was often used to extract confessions. "Talk," the interrogator would say, "and you can leave the chair." The irony, of course, was that leaving the chair didn't mean freedom. It often meant you were simply being prepared for another form of execution. The confession was just a formality, a cruel box to tick before the end. What's even more disturbing is that such a device wasn't limited to the worst criminals. In the tangled webs of medieval law, someone could find themselves in the chair of torment for crimes as varied as heresy, blasphemy, witchcraft, or political dissent. Sometimes the crime was little more than offending someone with more power. This wasn't justice. It was theater, the audience, the town officials, the guards, and in some cases, curious members of the public who were allowed to watch. And here's something to think about. This wasn't a quick spectacle like a hanging in the town square. The chair of torment could last hours, even days. Victims would often pass out from blood loss or shock, only to be woken with a splash of water so the punishment could continue. In the end, death wasn't the goal. It was the eventual side effect. The real aim was the breaking of a human being until nothing remained but compliance or silence. There's a chilling reality here. Medieval punishments, like the chair of torment, weren't just about crime and penalty. They were about control, ensuring that anyone watching would think twice before challenging the order of things. This was medieval politics disguised as justice, cruelty dressed in the robes of authority. As we leave the cold shadow of the torture chamber and step back into the narrow cobblestone streets, you can almost hear the echo of chains rattling in the distance. Somewhere, another chair waits in another dark room. But the medieval world was full of punishments that didn't just wound the body. They wounded the mind in ways equally permanent. Because up next, we travel to a punishment so humiliating, so bizarre, that it wasn't about spikes or blood at all. It was about turning a person into a walking joke in front of their entire community. And believe me, the shame lasted longer than the pain. In the heart of medieval Europe, punishments were often designed to be both spectacular and unforgettable. And few devices captured this philosophy quite like the breaking wheel, also known, quite fittingly, as the wheel of misfortune. This was not your ordinary cartwheel or mill wheel. This was a grim, towering contraption of wood and iron, standing as a public reminder that the law could literally crush you if you crossed it. The breaking wheel was a punishment reserved for the gravest of crimes: murder, treason, and acts considered so morally corrupt that the community demanded not just justice, but an unforgettable display of it. It was a performance, really half execution, half theater, and all cruelty. Here's how it worked. The condemned would be brought before the wheel, sometimes in the center of the town square, sometimes on a raised platform, so that everyone, children, merchants, priests, could witness every moment. Before the actual breaking began, the crowd was often whipped into a frenzy. The executioner might read aloud the crimes committed, not just to shame the accused, but to justify what was about to happen. The condemned was then bound, arms and legs spread wide to the spokes of the wheel, or placed beside it on a wooden platform. The executioner's weapon of choice, a heavy iron cudgel or hammer. The goal was methodical: to break the long bones of the arms and legs without necessarily killing the victim immediately. A strike to the shin, the forearm, the thigh, the upper arm, each blow calculated to shatter bone, rupture muscle, and turn limbs into twisted shapes. This was not done quickly. The pace was slow, deliberate, and almost ritualistic. After each bone was broken, the victim might be left for a moment, while the crowd reacted, sometimes with gasps, sometimes with cheers, sometimes with a strange, hushed awe, in some variations. The victim was tied directly to the wheel after the bones were broken. The wheel, now holding a mangled figure, would be hoisted upright on a pole. There, high above the ground, the condemned would be left to die, sometimes in hours, sometimes over several days, exposed to the sun, rain, and the stares of every passer-by. There was also a grim artistry to how the body was arranged. In certain regions, executioners prided themselves on creating symmetrical, almost decorative displays of their victims, bending limbs into unnatural arcs that fit perfectly between the spokes. It was, in their minds, both a warning and a work of public craftsmanship. You might think no one could survive such an ordeal. And yet, history records rare instances where victims lived for days after their bones were shattered. One famous case in the 14th century tells of a thief who endured the wheel for 3 full days before finally succumbing. His survival was seen not as a testament to human endurance, but as divine punishment drawn out to its fullest. In the most merciful lore, perhaps the most pragmatic versions of the punishment, the executioner would deliver what was called the coup de grace, a fatal blow to the chest, throat, or head after the bones were broken, ending the ordeal. But mercy was not always the point. More often than not, the spectacle was designed to last, both in the victim's suffering and in the memory of those who watched. The wheel also carried symbolic weight. In Christian Europe, its circular shape was sometimes compared to the wheel of fortune, a reminder that fate could turn against anyone at any time. One day you are on top, The next day you were strapped to the spokes, staring at the sky while the hammer fell again and again. There were even superstitions about the breaking wheel. Some towns believed that the blood of a person executed on it could cure illnesses, and it was not unheard of for people to secretly collect small amounts before the body was taken down. Others thought that a wheel execution was a kind of purification ritual, purging the land of evil by spilling it out in public. Executioners themselves held mixed feelings about the wheel. While it was undeniably one of the most feared punishments, it was also exhausting work. Breaking every major limb took precision. Too hard a blow, and you killed the victim too soon. Too soft, and you failed to break the bone. In some towns, a wheel execution could take an entire afternoon, with breaks for the executioner to rest, drink ale, and chat casually with the spectators before returning to finish the job. And yes, there were spectators, hundreds, sometimes thousands, depending on the notoriety of the case. For many medieval people, executions were a form of public entertainment, moral lesson, and civic ritual all rolled into one. Children were brought along to learn the consequences of wrongdoing. Traders sold food and drink nearby, and the local clergy used the occasion to preach about sin and redemption. The breaking wheel was eventually phased out in most of Europe by the 18th and 19th centuries, replaced by quicker forms of execution like hanging or the guillotine, but its legend remained. In art, literature, and oral storytelling, the wheel was remembered as the ultimate symbol of medieval brutality, a device where human bones met unyielding wood, and mercy was as scarce as sunlight in a dungeon. Even today, in some European towns, you might stumble upon an old wooden wheel mounted on a wall or displayed in a museum. Its spokes weathered, its rim iron. Tour guides speak of it with a mix of horror and fascination, explaining how it once served not to carry goods or grind grain, but to grind down human lives. And while it's easy to shake our heads at the cruelty of the past, the breaking wheel reminds us of something uncomfortable. Justice, in any era, often reflects the fears and desires of the society that enforces it. In the Middle Ages, that meant a justice system willing to turn a human body into both a warning and a spinning stage where the drama of crime and punishment played out in the most literal way imaginable. In the dim torchlight of a medieval town square, a new kind of punishment awaited those who had offended the moral order of the day. It was called the coffin torture, and, unlike the name suggests, it wasn't meant to bury you underground. No. This was far more public, and far more humiliating. Imagine a large human-shaped cage made of iron bars, sometimes crudely fashioned to mimic the outline of a man or woman. The condemned would be forced inside standing, crouched, or bent, the bars pressed uncomfortably against their body. And here's the cruel twist. The cage wasn't some roomy contraption. No, it fit so tightly around the prisoner that every twitch, every shift in position, was a struggle. Once locked in, the cage was hoisted up high on a wooden pole, or suspended from a gallows beam, right in the heart of the marketplace. The townsfolk would gather underneath, pointing, jeering, and tossing rotten vegetables. Children would laugh. Adults would spit. For those locked in, there was no escape from the eyes of the entire town. Every shameful second was on display. The idea was twofold. First, it physically restrained the prisoner, making escape impossible. Second, and more importantly, it inflicted a slow burn of psychological torture. Days could pass before a really sore death. Sometimes, in the heat of summer, the prisoner would bake in the sun, the iron scorching against bare skin. In winter, icy winds would cut through their thin clothing, numbing fingers and toes until frostbite took them. Food and water, that depended on the mercy of the guards or the cruelty of the crowd. Often, scraps of bread would be tossed their way, not out of kindness, but for entertainment. Watching the prisoner fumble to catch or chew in such a confined position, the stench was another weapon. Without a way to relieve themselves in private, prisoners would have to endure their own filth, baking or freezing in it, while people below wrinkled their noses in disgust. One of the most notorious uses of the coffin torture came during a wave of moral crackdowns in certain German towns. Adulterers, thieves, and swindlers were prime candidates. The moral message was loud and clear. This is what happens when you betray the trust of your community. But the punishment wasn't always deadly. Sometimes, after a few days, prisoner was lowered, their bodies stiff and aching, and then released back into society with the permanent mark of shame. The experience alone often broke a person's spirit, making them docile for life. The cruel genius of the coffin torture lay in its simplicity. No complex mechanics, no elaborate devices, just iron bars, a public square, and the relentless human appetite for humiliation. And yet, in some cases, this very punishment became a sort of morbid theater. Crowds gathered not out of civic duty, but out of sheer entertainment, as if the suffering of another was a festival attraction. Vendors would set up nearby selling pies, ale, and sweetmeats, turning the prisoner into the main act of a twisted carnival. Of course, not all prisoners endured silently. Some hurled insults back at the crowd, spat on those below, or sang loudly to pass the time. In rare moments, the onlookers respected this defiance, even tossing food and drink as a show of grudging admiration. But most of the time, the prisoners' voice grew hoarse, their head drooped, and the cage became not just a restraint, but a prison for their dignity. It's chilling to think that in the medieval mind, this wasn't considered excessive cruelty, was a practical deterrent. And perhaps, for the ruling powers, the beauty of the coffin torture was that the crowd itself became part of the punishment. Their mocking voices doing the work that no whip or rack could match. The coffin would stay up until the lesson was learned, or until the prisoner could no longer stand to learn it. By now, you and I have seen medieval Europe hand out punishments that make modern prisons look like luxury resorts. But just when you think they've exhausted the menu of absurdity, along comes trial by ordeal. And today's special, the trial by cold water, a method so illogical, it makes you wonder if common sense ever survived the Dark Ages. Picture the scene. It's a crisp morning in a small village in England, maybe 13th century. The locals are already gathering by the river, their breath puffing into the cold air. You hear the clang of the church bell, calling people to watch what's about to happen. And no, it's not a baptism, even though it might look like one for the first few seconds. This is justice, medieval style. At the heart of it is the accused, a gaunt man in a torn tunic, hands bound tightly in front of him with rough rope. He's shivering, but it's not just the cold, it's the knowledge that the next few minutes will decide his fate. And it's entirely out of his control. Now, here's how the trial by cold water worked. The idea was based on religious superstition. Holy water was pure, and therefore it would reject the guilty. If you were guilty, the water would not accept you, and you would float. If you were innocent, you'd sink, which of course, presented a whole new problem. Drowning. Yes, you heard me right. They designed a system where being declared innocent could literally kill you before anyone had the chance to celebrate. The villagers loved it though. It was part punishment, part public entertainment. Mothers would hold their children close. Some merchants might even set up a cart to sell warm cider or roasted chestnuts. After all, you can't waste a good crowd without trying to make a few coins. The priest would be there too, muttering prayers in Latin, as if the heavens themselves were paying attention to this riverside spectacle. Two burly men, usually guards or volunteers, would lead the accused to the water's edge. They'd strip him down to his undergarments, because apparently, justice required both humiliation and hypothermia. Then came the moment of truth. They'd tie a rope around his waist, just in case they needed to pull him out quickly, not because they feared for his safety. No, they needed him alive to face whatever punishment came next. It wouldn't do to have the entertainment cut short, with the crowd holding its breath. The man would be pushed into the frigid water. Sometimes he'd thrash instinctively. Other times he'd go still, perhaps trying to sink to prove his innocence. The onlookers would lean forward, debating in hushed tones. Was he floating? Was he sinking? Was this divine judgment or just basic physics? If he floated, congratulations, he was guilty. He'd be hauled back to shore, dripping and humiliated, ready for whatever sentence the village elders decided. This could be anything from whipping to execution. If he sank, well, they'd yank him out before he could fully drown, slap him on the back a few times, and announce that God had spoken. The man was innocent. Of course, logic would tell you that floating has nothing to do with morality. Body fat, muscle density, lung capacity, These all play a role. But in the medieval mind, science was a distant cousin no one invited to the party. Faith and fear ruled the day, and trial by cold water fit neatly into both. Women weren't spared from this ordeal either. In fact, it became infamous during the witch hunts of later centuries. Villages would toss suspected witches into ponds and lakes, convinced that their supposed pact with the devil would make the water spit them out. In these cases, passing the test could still be fatal. Either you drowned, or you survived, only to be burned at the stake later. Imagine the psychological toll this took on communities. Neighbors who once shared bread and gossip could turn on each other with a whisper of accusation, knowing that the trial by cold water might settle the matter. It was fear disguised as fairness, spectacle masquerading as justice, and yet, for centuries, it persisted. Kings and church officials eventually began to question its validity, partly because it was unreliable, partly because it didn't always serve their political needs. By the late Middle Ages, it was largely abandoned. In Western Europe, replaced by slightly less ridiculous methods of trial, though not necessarily less cruel. Still, the legacy of the trial by cold water lingers in our cultural memory. Think about it. How often do we still talk about people being thrown in at the deep end? It's not literal anymore, but the phrase carries that same sense of being tested in a sink-or-swim moment. If you were to stand on that medieval riverbank and watch one of these trials, you'd probably feel a knot in your stomach. On one hand, the human suffering would be impossible to ignore. On the other, you might find yourself caught up in the drama, the collective gasp of the crowd, the strange satisfaction people seem to get from seeing fate play out right before their eyes. It's a grim reminder of how easily entertainment and cruelty can become intertwined when fear holds the reins. The trial by cold water wasn't about truth, it was about reinforcing the power structures of the day. It told the villagers that God's will was on display, even if it was really just a dangerous game of chance. And if you think this was the peak of medieval justice, brace yourself. Because the next punishment we're about to explore makes the cold river look like a relaxing spa day. It's bloodier, more personal, and, in its own twisted way, even more humiliating. Now, let me take you to the edge of a small English village in the mid-1600s. The air smells faintly of wet timber and pondweed, and a cluster of villagers is gathered near a shallow, muddy riverbank. They're not here for fishing. They're here for entertainment. At the center of the commotion stands an oddly constructed contraption, part wooden chair, part long beam, part pivoting post. This, my friend, is the infamous cucking stool, a punishment device that combined public shaming with a literal splash of humiliation. It wasn't reserved for thieves or murderers. Oh no, the cucking stool was mostly for women accused of being scolds, which was basically the medieval term for talking too much, talking too loudly, or talking in a way that offended men. Yes, you heard that right. You could be paraded through the streets and dunked into a cold river simply because your neighbor didn't like your tone of voice at the market. The accused would be strapped to the chair, their arms bound to the armrests, their skirts tucked awkwardly around their knees. The long beam would then swing them out over the water and splash. Down they went. Sometimes once, sometimes twice, sometimes repeatedly until the crowd felt they'd learned their lesson. It wasn't designed to kill, but let's be honest, cold, dirty water, in a time before antibiotics. The risk of sickness was high. But here's the twist. The cucking stool wasn't only for women. Occasionally, a man would find himself in the chair for being a habitual drunk or a public nuisance. But it was rare, because let's face it, the punishment was socially framed to target female misbehavior. The whole process was an ugly mix of sexism, public spectacle, and community gossip turned into an official event. You can picture it. Children giggling, old men leaning on canes for a better view, vendors selling roasted chestnuts nearby. Punishment wasn't just about justice, it was entertainment. And the more someone screamed or cursed while being dunked, the better the show. Now here's something people forget. Sometimes, the accused leaned into the humiliation. There are records of women using the moment to shout their grievances, even louder, naming names, mocking officials, and even insulting the men dunking them. Imagine the crowd's shock when the scold they'd come to silence turned her watery punishment into an impromptu political rally. Still, as satisfying as a little rebellion might be, the cucking stool was more than a joke. It left its mark, not just physically, from bruises or cold exposure, but socially. In small villages where everyone knew each other, being dunked made you that person for years. Medieval society loved a good label, and once you were branded a troublemaker, you couldn't shake it. And this is where I have to pause and point out something that keeps coming up in medieval punishments. They were rarely about reform. They weren't trying to make you a better person. They were about public memory. The goal was to create a spectacle so vivid that both you and everyone watching would remember the shame forever. But the cucking stool also tells us something fascinating about medieval law enforcement. It was cheap. You didn't need guards to keep someone locked up for months. You just needed some wood, a riverbank, and a free afternoon when the whole town could watch. And because it was public, the punishment didn't require extra policing afterward. The community itself acted as enforcers through gossip, cold shoulders, and subtle acts of exclusion. If we zoom out for a moment, the cucking stool fits into a wider medieval obsession, turning punishment into theater. Whether it was the stocks, the pillory, or the dunking chair, the performance was just as important as the penalty. People remembered the story of the punishment. Do you remember the time Margaret called the mayor a goat and got dunked 3 times in January? And that story was passed down like folklore. But sometimes, the cucking stool became dangerous. There are recorded cases of people drowning during the process, especially if the river was fast or deep, or if someone fainted mid. In such cases, what was meant as a humiliating but non-lethal punishment turned into an accidental execution. And let's just say, when that happened, the crowd's laughter tended to fade pretty quickly. One of the strangest things about this punishment is that it lingered far longer than most medieval practices. Some towns in England and Scotland were still using versions of the cucking stool into the 18th century. Think about that even after the Enlightenment, after advances in science, medicine, and law. Some communities still believed the best way to deal with a troublesome person was to dunk them in water while the neighbors watched. You might wonder, did anyone ever refuse to sit in the cucking stool? Oh yes. And that's where things got even more absurd. In those cases, the accused might be physically restrained and forced into the chair. But there are a few recorded instances where someone escaped mid-process, running through the streets, still tied to the chair, with the beam dragging behind them. You can almost hear the shouts, the barking dogs, and the general chaos. The cucking stool is a perfect example of medieval justice being a blend of petty community politics, gender bias, and low-budget theater. It wasn't about the crime fitting the punishment, it was about the punishment fitting the audience's appetite for drama. And yet, as bizarre as it seems, it's not even the most theatrical humiliation device from the period. There's one that makes the cucking stool look almost polite, a punishment that turned the human body itself into a walking billboard of shame, forcing the guilty to parade their disgrace through the streets. And that, my friend, is where our journey is heading next. If you thought dunk tanks were a modern carnival invention, let me introduce you to the medieval version, a far less fun, far more life-threatening experience, known as the ordeal of cold water. And no, this wasn't some light-hearted community game where you aim to splash your friends. This was a deadly, serious legal trial, where survival itself became the evidence of guilt or innocence. The premise was as simple as it was terrifying. Accused criminals, often witches, heretics, or petty thieves, were tied up and tossed into a body of cold water, usually a river or pond. But here's the twisted part. Floating was considered proof of guilt, and sinking was seen as a sign of innocence. Yes, you heard me right. In their minds, water, being pure, would reject the wicked and cause them to float, while the innocent would be accepted into the water and sink. So essentially, you were innocent. If you drowned, imagine standing on the muddy bank of a frigid village pond. The crowd gathered like it's the social event of the month. The bailiff reads out your supposed crime, maybe someone accused you of stealing a loaf of bread, or worse, practicing witchcraft because their cow mysteriously stopped giving milk. Your wrists and ankles are bound with coarse rope, maybe even weighted with stones, but not too much after all. They didn't want to cheat the test. The onlookers murmur, some sympathetic, others eager to see what will happen. The priest mutters a prayer, though you might be forgiven for suspecting he's not entirely on your side. Then, with no more ceremony than tossing in a sack of potatoes, the guards heave you into the icy water. Your body hits the surface with a shock that knocks the breath from your lungs. The cold is so sharp, it feels like hundreds of needles pricking your skin. You thrash instinctively. After all, you want to live. But that's exactly the problem. The more you struggle to keep your head above water, the more the watching crowd nods knowingly. Ah, see, she floats. Must be guilty. Of course, this whole thing ignored the fact that human bodies have natural buoyancy, especially if bound in a way that traps air and clothing. But medieval law was less concerned with physics than with symbolism. Floating meant the devil's influence kept you from being embraced by the sacred water. Sinking meant God accepted your soul, although you'd be dead by the time they hauled you out. Now, here's the part that makes it even more absurd. In some cases, if you sank and the crowd managed to drag you up before you drowned, you'd be declared innocent, but still faced further punishment for whatever minor infraction you were accused of. Imagine enduring that harrowing test, only to be fined for disturbing the peace. The ordeal was especially popular during witch hunts. The fear of witchcraft ran deep in medieval Europe, and the logic was circular. Witches were evil. Water rejected evil, so if you floated, you were a witch. Never mind that fear and self-preservation would make anyone flail around. The sight of someone bobbing in the water was enough for the villagers to feel justified in their suspicion. Some communities had their own variations of the ordeal. In parts of Germany, they preferred using a long pole to push the accused under the water for a certain length of time, counting aloud as the poor soul fought for breath. In England, records show the practice was still in use as late as the 17th century, particularly during the fever of witch trials. One of the most infamous examples took place in East Anglia, in the mid-1600s, during the reign of the notorious witch hunter, Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general. Hopkins organized countless cold water trials, targeting mostly women who were poor, widowed, or simply disliked by their neighbors. His methods were cruel, but effective at producing evidence that satisfied terrified communities. But here's an interesting twist. There are reports of people deliberately holding their breath and trying to sink in hopes of proving their innocence. A desperate gamble that often ended in tragedy. The human body's instinct to breathe is overpowering, and the cold made it even harder to stay submerged. Many never resurfaced alive. The symbolism of water as a divine judge wasn't unique to Europe. Similar rituals existed in other cultures, though often with different interpretations. In India, for example, trial by water sometimes involved retrieving a stone from a riverbed while holding one's breath. Failure meant guilt. But in the European cold water ordeal, the outcome was almost always fatal for the accused, no matter how the test went. Why did such a blatantly flawed system persist for so long? Partly because it was convenient. It allowed local authorities to avoid lengthy investigations, replacing due process with a spectacle that satisfied the public's thirst for justice. It also fed into the superstition that nature itself could not lie, a comforting but deadly belief in a world where famine, plague, and violence were daily realities. Over time, the ordeal began to fall out of favor, especially as more educated legal minds recognized its barbarity and inefficiency. By the late medieval period, many regions had outlawed it, replacing it with less theatrical but still brutal punishments, like the stocks or the pillory. Yet echoes of the practice lingered for centuries, and it remains one of the most notorious examples of medieval superstition overriding common sense. Standing here in our imaginary village, watching the last ripples fade on the pond's surface, you can almost feel the chill seep into your bones. The crowd disperses, satisfied that justice has been served, whether you floated or sank. No one questions the logic. No one wonders if perhaps the water doesn't care about sin or innocence. In their world, this was truth, a truth that could kill you. As grim as it sounds, the cold water ordeal tells us something important about the medieval mind. Justice was as much about symbolism and public display as it was about truth. In a society where literacy was rare and science was fledgling, The sight of a body sinking or floating seemed like undeniable proof. And when fear and superstition ruled the day, reason didn't stand a chance. But don't get too comfortable. Because if you think being tied up and thrown into freezing water was the worst fate you could face, wait until you hear about the next punishment. It's one that didn't just test your body or your soul. It tested your pride in a way that could haunt you for the rest of your life. By now, you've probably realized medieval Europe had an endless imagination for punishments. From branding irons to public shaming, there seemed to be no limit to the creativity or cruelty of justice. But sometimes, the law's targets weren't thieves, murderers, or treasonous plotters. No, sometimes they went after entertainers. Take the case of Thomas the Piper, a street musician in 14th century France. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't rich enough to be worth robbing. He wasn't even particularly talented, if we're being honest. But Thomas had one undeniable trait: persistence. Morning, noon, and night. He played the same shrill tune on his bagpipes outside the market square. At first, the villagers tolerated him. Then they avoided him. Then they complained. Finally, the local magistrate decided to make an example of him, not because he was a criminal, but because he was a public nuisance and disturber of the peace. The punishment: something called the barrel pillory. Now, picture this. A massive wooden barrel, open at the top and bottom, with 2 holes for legs. Thomas was stripped down to his undergarments and lowered into the barrel until it reached his armpits. His legs stuck out below, forcing him to shuffle awkwardly like some absurd walking wine cask. And here's the kicker. He had to keep playing his bagpipes the entire time. They paraded him through the streets, villagers jeering and laughing, children tossing vegetable scraps at him. The magistrate's thinking was simple. If Thomas wanted to be the center of attention so badly, then fine, he'd get it, just not the kind he wanted. This wasn't just about humiliation. It was about control. Medieval authorities understood something we sometimes forget. Today's public perception is power. A man who's laughed at cannot easily be feared or respected. Thomas wasn't executed or even imprisoned, but his reputation was ruined. Even after his sentence ended, people mimed playing bagpipes whenever they saw him. Eventually, he left town, never to return. The barrel pillory was used elsewhere too, though sometimes without the musical twist. In parts of Germany, drunks were shoved into these contraptions and forced to stagger home under the weight of the heavy wood. In some cases, the barrels were painted with insulting phrases like, "I am a glutton," or "town drunkard," ensuring everyone knew the crime. You might think this was harmless after all. No one died. But in small medieval communities, where reputations determined your livelihood, public humiliation could be a social death sentence. Once you were marked as a fool, you might as well have been wearing that barrel for the rest of your life. Now, you might ask, why didn't people simply refuse to comply? Why not resist being put in a barrel in the first place? The answer lies in the nature of medieval justice. Defying a court order wasn't just a legal problem, it was a direct challenge to the lord or magistrate's authority. Refuse a barrel pillory, and you'd likely end up in a far less humorous punishment: a whipping post, a dungeon cell, or even the gallows. So most complied, shuffling through town while the crowd pointed and laughed. And the crowd, they loved it. In a world without movies, television, or internet drama, public punishments were a form of entertainment. People might forget the details of the crime, but they remembered the spectacle. One chronicler wrote about a man in Nuremberg who wore a barrel so large that he had to be rolled through the streets like a giant cask. He was so humiliated that he tried to hide his face with his hands only, to be ordered to remove them so everyone could get a good look. The psychology here is fascinating. Public shame wasn't just about punishing the offender. It was about warning everyone else. Seeing Thomas the Piper in his musical barrel reminded the villagers that being too loud, too persistent, or too annoying could bring you trouble. It was the medieval equivalent of a "Do Not Disturb" sign, backed by law enforcement. Interestingly, these punishments could sometimes backfire. In some towns, especially in Italy, public shaming turned certain criminals into folk heroes. If the offender played along cracking jokes, winking at the crowd, they could win sympathy. Suddenly, the punishment lost its sting. But Thomas, he wasn't that kind of man. By the end of his march, he wasn't playing music anymore. His face was red, his eyes downcast, and the jeers of the crowd seemed to echo off the barrel like a drum. The final humiliation came when the magistrate ordered him to dump the barrel in the town square and leave it there for 3 days, a reminder of what happens to troublemakers. That's the other thing about medieval justice, it was often designed to linger in the mind. The barrel wasn't just a momentary embarrassment, it became part of the town's memory. Years later, if a child played too loudly, parents might say, "Careful, or you'll end up like Thomas the Piper." Of course, as with many punishments of the time, the barrel pillory eventually faded out, replaced by more standardized systems of law. But its legacy remains in our language. The phrase "over a barrel," meaning helpless or trapped. Some historians think it comes from punishments like these. Still, for me, the most striking part of the story isn't the punishment itself, it's how quickly the crowd turned from neighbors to tormentors. In medieval towns, the line between community support and collective cruelty was razor-thin. Today, we like to think we're more civilized, but one glance at online shaming might make you wonder how much has really changed. And Thomas, well, his fate was sealed the moment the magistrate decided his music was no longer a harmless quirk. In the eyes of medieval justice, disrupting the peace was as worthy of punishment as breaking the law. He left behind no records, no descendants. No more songs, just a strange story that survived in local chronicles. As absurd as it sounds, this wasn't even close to the weirdest punishment Europe could invent. If you thought being stuck in a barrel was bad, wait until you hear about a punishment that involved walking backward through town while carrying a dead animal. One that hadn't been dead very long. Hey guys, tonight, we begin with something that might sound like a twisted game show challenge. But in medieval Europe, it was deadly serious. And I mean deadly. Picture this. You're standing by the edge of a cold, murky pond, your wrists bound tightly together, a crowd of villagers surrounding you, whispering prayers. Or maybe just waiting for a good show. The priest says a few words, someone pushes you forward, and splash, you're in. But this isn't a punishment for stealing bread or talking back to the Lord. Oh no, this was the infamous ordeal by water, a trial meant to prove whether you were innocent or in league with the devil. Now, the logic behind it, and I'm using that word generously, was this. Water was considered pure and holy, blessed by God himself. So, if you were innocent, the water would accept you, and you'd sink. But if you were guilty, the water would reject you, and you'd float. Sounds simple, right? Except there's a tiny problem. People naturally float a bit. Meaning, if you didn't sink like a rock right away, well, congratulations, you were officially guilty and headed for the gallows. The setup was almost theatrical. They'd bind you, sometimes tie a rope to your waist so they could drag you out later. Maybe, and march you down to the village pond or riverbank. If the accused was a woman, especially suspected of witchcraft, this scene often became the whole town's entertainment. Mothers held their children up high to see. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts. And you, the unlucky suspect, got ready for your big debut. And here's the kicker. Sinking didn't necessarily mean you were saved. Sure, in theory, you were innocent, but if you drowned before anyone hauled you back up, well, your name was cleared, but you were still dead. Think of it as medieval justice's very own catch-22. There's one famous case from the 12th century where a knight accused of treason was subjected to the ordeal. Now, you might think armor would make him sink instantly, right? But the authorities had that loophole closed. They stripped him down, tied him up, and still declared him guilty when his head bobbed above the waterline for a moment. It's almost as if they weren't really hoping for innocent verdicts. The practice was especially common in witch trials. In England, during the late 1500s, a witchfinder named Matthew Hopkins used it relentlessly. He claimed it was foolproof. But conveniently, most guilty verdicts just happened to line up with whoever the villagers already hated. And if you think they were gentle, think again. Sometimes they'd toss people in during winter, the ice broken just enough for a human body to slip through. Imagine that freezing water shocking your lungs, your limbs locking up as the crowd decided your fate. Now, why did people believe in such a thing? Well, in a time when religion ruled over law, symbolism was powerful. If God wanted you to survive, you would, and if you didn't, well, clearly it was part of his plan. Questioning that logic was as dangerous as the ordeal itself. Some communities even added extra flair, chanting priests, holy relics nearby, and spectators making the sign of the cross as you flailed in the water. And no one could say the outcome was biased after all. It was God's judgment. This way, the authorities could wash their hands of personal responsibility. Much like Pontius Pilate, in rare cases, someone floated, but still managed to argue their innocence, claiming their buoyancy was due to unusual body fat, or the devil trying to frame them. But the truth was, once your head popped above that surface, the crowd's mind was made up so. In medieval Europe, if you ever heard the words, trial by water, you knew you were in deep trouble, literally. It wasn't about justice. It was about confirming what people already suspected, with a bit of drama thrown in for good measure. And if you sank, well, I hope your family appreciated the clean record you left behind. But here's the real twist. Some rulers eventually banned the ordeal, not because they suddenly cared about fairness, but because too many people were dying before they could be properly executed or fined. And in medieval law, dead bodies couldn't pay taxes. Now, if you think being tossed into freezing water was the worst humiliation your neighbors could inflict, wait until you hear about the next bizarre punishment, one that involved dragging you through the streets in a way that made everyone remember your shame for years to come. And no, it didn't involve ropes or chains. It involved something much, much messier. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a scene not in a dungeon or a battlefield, but in the middle of a noisy, sunlit village square. The smell of fresh bread drifts from the baker's hut, kids are chasing chickens through the mud, and suddenly you hear the distinct scrape of wooden legs dragging across cobblestone. All eyes turn toward a woman, her cheeks flushed, her head bowed, not because she's injured or sick, but because she's about to be humiliated in front of everyone she's ever known, and not in the privacy of whispers. Oh no, the punishment is a spectacle. They call it the shaming stool. Sometimes it's a simple wooden bench. Other times it's a heavy, almost throne-like chair built specifically for maximum discomfort and public visibility. The person accused, usually a woman, though not always, is forced to sit there while the entire community strolls past, making comments, spitting insults, or laughing outright. You're not in chains. You're not bleeding. But in a world where your reputation is your lifeline, this is almost worse than any lash of a whip. The charge is often gossip. Yes, in many medieval towns, spreading rumors could land you here. Ironically, the gossip didn't stop because of a tit just got juicier. People loved watching someone be punished for loose talk, then immediately went home to talk about it. It's like medieval reality TV, but without the ad breaks. But sometimes, the stool was only the start. You might be forced to wear a ridiculous hat, tall, pointed, or covered in bells so that people could hear you coming and laugh before they even saw your face. In some places, they used a gossip bridle alongside the stool, a metal contraption, with a tongue plate shoved into your mouth so you physically couldn't speak. Imagine the mixture of humiliation and frustration. Your cheeks aching, your tongue pressed down, and people walking by saying, well, maybe next time she'll think twice before she says, my bread was stale. The worst part, these punishments were public and prolonged. You could be left there for hours, even in rain or freezing wind, as the town carried on around you. Sometimes, a stool was placed at the very center of the market square, so every transaction, every haggled price, every farmer selling turnips happened with you as the unwilling centerpiece. And here's the twisted genius of it. This wasn't just punishment for the accused, it was a warning to everyone else. Like the medieval version of a YouTube comment section pinned to the top. See what happens if you step out of line. But there's an even darker layer. In some communities, the shaming stool was placed on a wooden platform and hoisted above ground level, almost like a mini stage. The higher you were, the more visible you became, and the more relentless the juice. If you thought medieval justice was about fair trials and sober judges, think again. This was about control through humiliation. And yet, in certain cases, these punishments backfired. Some people, especially those with sharper wit or thicker skin, turned their time in the shaming chair into a performance. They'd roll their eyes, make faces, or even roast their taunters right back, turning the spectacle into their show. This annoyed the authorities to no end, because nothing undermines public humiliation like the victim enjoying it. Still, for most, the shaming stool was devastating. When you left it, you carried more than physical discomfort. You carried a reputation that could take years to shake. People remembered, they told their children. And medieval life was small enough that your name could be ruined forever in a single afternoon, and here's where it gets even stranger. These punishments weren't reserved for serious crimes, gossip, drunkenness, minor insults. Even selling goods at the wrong price, things that today might get you a stern warning, or a fine could land you in that seat. The message was clear. The community watches you, the community judges you, and the community will see you punished in the most personal way possible now. You might think that's the peak of small-town cruelty. But trust me, in the next part, we're stepping away from mere embarrassment and straight into a punishment that was part torture device, part carnival ride, and all nightmare fuel. It involved water, spinning, and the medieval idea of fun which, as you'll see, was far from ours. We leave the monastery's shadow and head back down into the valley, the road widening until it opens onto a sight that makes you blink twice. Gone are the solemn monks and their silent courtyards here. It's chaos. The fair has come to town. Bright pennants flap in the wind. Stalls are piled high with pies, roasted meat, and tankards of foaming ale. Jugglers toss clubs in the air. Musicians thump out tunes on lutes and drums. And somewhere off to the left, a man is swallowing a sword while a crowd cheers him on. But we're not here for the jugglers or the roasted pig. We're here for the court on wheels. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. A traveling justice wagon, pulled by 4 huge draft horses, painted in gaudy red and gold. On the side is a makeshift balcony where the judge sits. Robes flowing, a great hat perched like a crow on his head. This is no castle, lord, or church abbot. This is a circuit judge, sent by the crown to deal with minor crimes in far-flung towns. He's part lawman, part entertainer, and part showman. His punishments aren't about scaring people in private. They're about making sure the crowd never forgets the spectacle. We push closer through the throng until we're standing near the front. The judge is already in full swing, calling up the first case. A young man accused of cheating at dice. The evidence, 3 weighted dice, held aloft like a trophy by the town constable. The judge bangs a gavel, though it looks more like a polished mallet, and declares, "Let him dance the punishment jig." 2 guards grab the man and lead him to a wooden stage at the foot of the wagon. A fiddler strikes up a tune, and the man is forced to hop and jig in time with the music, while the crowd roars with laughter. If he stops, the guards prod him with sticks. It's silly, humiliating, and exhausting. The perfect cocktail for public shame. But the fairground court doesn't stop at dancing. The next case is a woman accused of selling watered-down ale, a crime almost as serious as treason, in a place where beer is safer to drink than the local water. Her sentence: she's tied to a barrel and rolled gently, but very publicly down the length of the fairground. The crowd follows, jeering, tossing breadcrumbs, and shouting creative insults that I won't repeat here. By the time she's untied, she's dizzy, covered in dust, and worst of all, everyone now knows her face. In a small medieval town, that's a punishment that lasts long after the fair packs up. You lean toward me, half laughing, half shocked. This is like street theater. Exactly, and the judge knows it. Each case is designed to be quick, dramatic, and unforgettable. In a world without newspapers, punishments like this spread by word of mouth, and nothing makes a better story than watching someone, get chased by a goose while tied to a pole. Yes, that's a real thing. The next man up has been caught stealing eggs from a market stall. His punishment: he's tied to a post with a live goose tucked under one arm. The goose is not happy about this arrangement. It hisses, flaps, and occasionally bites him on the ear while the crowd howls. The symbolism is obvious. You stole from the goose, now you suffer the goose. We move closer to the wagon steps, and you can smell the mingling scents of roasted meat, spilled ale, and sweaty humanity. The judge wipes his brow, clearly enjoying the chaos. The traveling court isn't just about justice, It's about reminding people that the crown can reach them anywhere, and that breaking the law will be both costly and humiliating. Then comes the final case of the day, and it's a showstopper. A burly man is dragged forward, accused of picking pockets, while the crowd watched the fire breather. He swears he's innocent, but the judge waves him silent. We'll have the cucking basket. Now, you might remember the cucking stool from the village, the dunking seat over water. This is its rowdy cousin. The cucking basket is a large, wicker cage attached to a long pole. The accused is crammed inside, and then, to the roaring delight of the crowd, the cage is swung back and forth like a pendulum. Every so often, the guards let it drop into a shallow, muddy ditch before hauling it up again. The man's protests are drowned out by laughter, drums, and the occasional blast of a horn by the time he's released. He's coated in mud and dripping with what I hope is just water from the ditch. The judge stands, bows to the crowd, and declares the court adjourned. The fair begins to dissolve back into its normal rhythm. Children chasing dogs, vendors hawking sweets, fiddlers playing jigs, but you and I know we've just seen something more than cheap entertainment. We've seen justice as a traveling carnival, designed to make lawbreakers a laughingstock, and to remind everyone that punishment can be a party. We turn to leave, but I stop you. Don't think this is the height of bizarre punishments, I say. If you really want to see where creativity meets cruelty, you need to come with me to the sea. You raise an eyebrow. Coastal towns, I explain, had punishments the inland folk couldn't dream of. Things with tides, barnacles, and a whole lot of salt water. And trust me, you don't want to be the one standing on the dock when the punishment boat comes in. The sun is setting, the fairground fading behind us, and the faint cry of gulls drifts in from the direction we're heading. We leave the castle behind, the heavy wooden gate creaking shut behind us. The night air feels fresher now, almost sweet, though I can't shake the echo of the rack turning in the dungeon. You can still hear the faint noise of the market square, somewhere behind us. But we're walking in the opposite direction toward the dark silhouette of the monastery on the hill. If the castle looked like a clenched fist, the monastery looks like folded hands, calm, prayerful, harmless. But don't be fooled. Inside those walls, they practice a form of punishment so refined, so quietly cruel. It could make even a hardened soldier flinch. We follow a winding dirt road, lit only by the pale moon. The closer we get, the more you notice the faint smell of incense in the air, mixing with the sharper scent of wax and old wood. A bell tolls in the distance deep, resonant, and slow. It's not the bell for prayer. This is the bell for discipline. We step through the monastery's outer gate, greeted by a monk with a shaved crown, his robe hanging in heavy folds. His face is serene, but his eyes measure you like a tailor sizing cloth. Without a word, he leads us through a narrow cloister, into a courtyard where a line of monks stands silently, heads bowed. At the far end, another monk is on his knees. His robe has been stripped to the waist, revealing a thin, pale back. Beside him stands the abbot, holding a rod made from twisted birch branches. The silence is absolute. No chants, no whispers. Just the swish of the rod as it cuts the air and lands with a sharp crack across the man's shoulders. You flinch, but the monk receiving the blows doesn't cry out. His penance isn't for theft or violence, it's for falling asleep during night prayers. And here's the thing. In the monastery, spiritual failings were punished as harshly as crimes in the outside world. After the 10th strike, the abbot speaks not to the punished monk, but to the others. His voice is calm, almost gentle. Let this be a reminder to watch over the soul, as well as the tongue. The man is led away, and the courtyard empties as quickly as it filled. You whisper to me, that was controlled, and I nod. This isn't chaos. This isn't public humiliation. This is discipline as an art form. But it gets stranger. The abbot allows us into the refectory, a long hall lined with wooden benches. Normally, it's for meals eaten in silence, but tonight there's a different gathering. A young monk is brought forward, his face pale, eyes darting nervously. His crime: speaking during the great silence after Compline prayers. The punishment isn't a beating. It's the penitent's table. He's made to sit alone at a small, low table in the corner. his meal a crust of bread and a cup of water, while the others eat warm stew and fresh loaves. He's not allowed to look up. He's not allowed to speak for a week. It's isolation, shame, and hunger all in one. But the monastery has punishments even quieter than that, ones you can't see at first. We're led to the scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts by candlelight. One of them is working without a stool, forced to kneel on the cold stone floor while he writes. This is the kneeling penance, given for sloppy handwriting or spilling ink. No blows, no shouting. Just the slow grind of discomfort that makes hours feel like days. You might think this all sounds tame compared to the castle's rack or the village's stocks, but here's the thing. These punishments were designed to work from the inside out. They broke your will slowly, invisibly. A week of silence, a month of isolation. Years of extra labor. These things bent people in ways a whip never could. We're shown to the cloister garden, where a monk is digging a trench. His robe is dirty, his hands blistered. He's been assigned to penance labor, moving soil from one end of the garden to the other, and then back again. It's work with no purpose except obedience. You can see in his eyes that he's done this for days. The abbot, who's been silent until now, turns to us and says, "A man may recover from the lash, but from the loss of his own pride. That takes a lifetime. You get it now." The monastery doesn't need loud punishments. They make you agree with your own humiliation. And the scariest part, many of the monks believe it's good for them. But there's one more thing the abbot wants us to see. He leads us down a narrow passage to a small wooden door. Inside is a tiny, windowless room, just big enough for a man to stand or sit. No bed, no light. Just cold stone and a faint smell of damp straw. This is the cell of silence here. Monks who break their vows are locked away for days, weeks, sometimes months, with nothing but their thoughts and the occasional crust of bread passed through a hole in the wall. The mind is left to wander, and the guilt, they say, becomes unbearable. The abbot closes the door and lets the darkness swallow us for a moment. You feel the stillness pressing in, your heartbeat suddenly loud in your ears. Then the door opens, and the light feels almost blinding. We step back into the night. The monastery behind us now just a silhouette against the moon. You exhale, and I know you're thinking what I'm thinking. This place is scarier than the castle in its own way. But our journey isn't over. Because while the monks perfected the art of quiet punishment, there's another place that turned cruelty into public theater on a scale. You can't imagine the medieval fairground court, and if you thought monks were creative, wait until you see what traveling judges did to criminals in front of 1,000 drunk peasants. You follow me away from the noise of the market square, past the flickering torchlight, and the smell of smoke drifting in from roasting meat. The laughter and jeers of the crowd fade into the background, replaced by the low, steady hum of crickets in the grass. The cobblestones give way to a smoother path. And then there it is, the castle. It rises above us like a giant stone fist, clenched against the night sky. Narrow windows like watchful eyes peer down at us. You can feel the temperature drop as we step inside the outer gate, partly because the walls are so thick, and partly because, well, this place doesn't exactly radiate warmth. Inside the courtyard, a pair of guards stand motionless, their hands resting on halberds. They're the kind of men who could probably stare down a charging bear without blinking. We pass them, and the heavy wooden doors of the great hall creak open. The sound changes instantly out there. The air was alive with voices. In here, it's like stepping into a church during confession. You hear the faint crackle of a fire from the far hearth, but the space is mostly silent, save for the occasional echo of our footsteps. And then, at the far end of the hall, we see it. The high-backed wooden chair, where the lord of the castle sits. His robe is trimmed with fur, his crown small, but unmistakable. This isn't the sort of man who needs a massive golden crown to prove he's in charge. His power is in his stare. Next to him stands the bailiff, holding a long scroll of accusations. Beside the scroll, a thin wooden rod sign that punishment is about to be handed out. A prisoner is brought forward. She's a young woman, barefoot, hair tangled, dress torn at the sleeve. She looks terrified, and as the bailiff reads the charge, spreading false prophecies and omens, You get the sense this is going to end badly. Here's the thing about medieval courts. Evidence was optional. If someone of power felt you were guilty, that was often enough. And punishments here weren't meant for public entertainment. They were designed for maximum obedience. The Lord leans forward and speaks softly to the bailiff, who nods and motions for the guards. They bring forward something that looks harmless. At first, a simple wooden frame with straps. You glance at me in confusion. I lean in and whisper, "That's the scold's bridle." It's a metal cage that fits over the head, with a flat piece that slides into the mouth, pressing the tongue down. If they were feeling particularly creative, they'd attach spikes to that plate, so any movement of the tongue meant instant pain. In the village, it was used for gossipers. Here in the castle, it's for people who speak anything the Lord doesn't like. The young woman tries to back away, but the guards hold her still as the bridle is locked in place. Her eyes widen, in panic, as the metal bites down. The room stays silent. No jeering, no vegetables thrown, just the slow, calculated crushing of her dignity. She's led away, the bells on the bridle jingling softly. You shiver. Out in the market, punishments were a noisy spectacle. In here, they're cold and surgical-like. A warning whispered directly into the bones of anyone watching. But that's not the most unnerving part. The most unnerving part is how quickly it's over. The Lord barely glances at the woman as she's taken away, already turning to the next case. It's not personal, it's just routine. The next man is accused of stealing a hunting dog from the castle kennels. Out in the village, maybe he'd be tossed in the stocks. Here, the Lord orders the ordeal by water. Now, you might think, ordeal by water means drowning. But in medieval thinking, it was far stranger. They believed pure water would reject a guilty person. So they'd tie your hands and feet, throw you into a pool, and watch. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and got punished further. It was basically a lose-lose situation, unless you were a champion breath holder. The guards drag the man away to the courtyard well, and I can see the same thought crossing your mind as mine. This isn't justice, it's theater for the powerful. And we haven't even scratched the surface. Because, as we move toward the side door, the bailiff gestures for us to follow. "There's one more punishment tonight," he says, his voice low. "One for a man who betrayed his oath to the crown." We descend a narrow spiral staircase, lit only by flickering wall torches. The air grows damp, heavy with the smell of stone and mildew. At the bottom, we emerge into a long, low chamber, the dungeon. Iron rings are bolted to the walls. Chains clink. Faintly in the darkness, in the center of the room sits a wooden table, not for eating, but for stretching. The rack. The prisoner is already there, his wrists and ankles bound to rollers at either end. A guard turns the handle slowly, and the ropes tighten, pulling the man's limbs taut. He groans, then screams as the tendons strain. The Lord doesn't even come down for this. He doesn't have to. The rack speaks for itself. You grip my arm. This is a far cry from the rowdy village punishments. This is methodical destruction. It's not about making people laugh. It's about making sure no one, ever, forgets who holds the power as we leave. The bailiff gives me a knowing smile. "The people outside think the stocks are cruel," he says. "They should be grateful. They never see what happens down here." When we step back into the night air, the square feels almost cheerful in comparison. The smell of beer and smoke, the chatter of villagers, it's almost a relief. But you and I know better now. We've seen the two faces of medieval punishment, the public and the private. And if you think the castle is the worst of it, you're wrong, because next, I'm taking you to the monastery, and the monks there. They've got punishments that make both the village and the castle look like child's play. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a stroll through a medieval street, so alive with scandal that you can practically smell the trouble in the air, quite literally. Because no one has invented deodorant yet. You're walking beside me, trying to keep your boots clean on a cobblestone road that looks like it's been through 20 wars, 3 plagues, and 1 very bad wine festival. It's twilight. The sun is dipping low behind crooked timber-built houses, and you can hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere in the distance. But our attention isn't on the forge, it's on the open square up ahead. That's where the real entertainment is. See, in medieval Europe, Netflix and chill didn't exist. It was more like public execution and gossip. We're heading toward the pillory, basically a medieval photo booth. Except you get stuck in it for hours, with your head and hands trapped, while every passing villager gets to admire your shame. People throw things at you, rotten vegetables, dead rats, maybe the occasional chicken, if someone's feeling generous. And no, there's no skip ad button. You just have to stand there until the town decides you've been humiliated enough. Tonight's unfortunate star. A baker caught selling bread that was smaller than the law allowed. In medieval times, cheating on bread weight was basically a federal crime. People didn't mess with bread, it was life itself. So here he is, head poking out of the pillory, a sad little loaf dangling around his neck on a rope, while a group of kids throw cabbages at him like they're in some twisted carnival game. I lean over and whisper to you, this is just the warm-up, because here's the thing, people. Think medieval punishments were all about death. They weren't. Death was quick. No, the real art of the Middle Ages was in humiliation. The church and the crown didn't just want to punish you. They wanted to make sure your grandchildren still felt embarrassed about it. And to do that, they got creative. We step past the baker and his lumpy bread, and head toward another contraption, cucking stool. Picture a sturdy wooden chair attached to a long beam. The unlucky person sits on it, gets strapped in. And then the whole seat is swung out over a river or cesspool and dunked repeatedly. Who got this honor? Nagging wives, gossipers, scolding neighbors. And yes, sometimes men, but mostly women. It was basically medieval Europe's way of saying, shut up, except with a lot more dysentery. As we walk, you notice a man selling mead from a barrel and another selling meat pies that look suspiciously like they've been sitting out since last Christmas. Everyone's buzzing with excitement tonight. There's a special event, the kind of thing people cancel dinner plans for. We squeeze through the crowd and there it is, the mask of shame. Imagine a metal helmet shaped into a grotesque face, ears, a pig snout, or a tongue that sticks out comically. They clamp it onto someone's head so tight it leaves marks. The poor soul wearing it. A man who's been spreading rumors about the local lord's daughter. The mask doesn't just look ridiculous. It has little bells that jingle with every movement, so everyone hears you coming. You can't hide, you can't blend in. You are now the town's walking joke. You glance at me like this can't get weirder, and I smirk, oh it will. See, this is the side of medieval punishment no one talks about. It wasn't just about keeping order. It was about making the punishment memorable, theatrical, almost. Festive. The authorities wanted fear, yes, but they also wanted a show. And let's be honest, human nature hasn't changed that much. If someone set up a humiliation parade in the town square today, you know half the population would show up with popcorn. We weave our way toward the far end of the square where a platform has been built. This is where the main event is about to happen. The punishment of the ale short measurer. In medieval taverns, if you sold ale in mugs smaller than advertised, you weren't just a cheat, you were practically a heretic. And the penalty? You got dragged through the town on a sled, barrels tied to your legs, while people dumped stale beer on your head. Think of it as the medieval version of a Yelp review. Very public and very, very sticky. The crowd starts chanting. Kids climb onto their father's shoulders. Old women lean out of windows to get a better look. A drum starts beating slowly, ceremonially, and then there he is. The ale short measurer himself, soaked, shivering, and smelling like the worst pub floor you've ever set foot on. The people roar with laughter as he's paraded past. His shame will linger long after the beer smell fades, if it ever does. As we turn away, I tell you, this is just one street, one night. Imagine an entire kingdom's worth of punishments like this. Because trust me, there are darker, stranger, and far more disturbing examples than what you've seen so far. Tonight, we've only dipped our toes into the shallow end of medieval cruelty. The deeper we go, the more we'll see punishments that weren't just about humiliation, but about bending reality. Making the criminal live inside a nightmare designed specifically for their crime. And in some cases, it wasn't even clear if the punishment was worse than the crime or if the crime ever happened at all. But I'll warn you now, once we start down this road, there's no turning back. These punishments will mess with your head, stick in your memory, and maybe even make you question whether the so-called good old days were good at all. You ready for that? Good, because next, we're going to leave the town square and step into a castle's private court. And that's where the punishments get personal. No crowds, no public laughter. Just you, the accused, and the cold, calculating eye